All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 3 for PPA 500. I am going to turn my camera off because in my budgeting course last time, I'm teaching from home these past 2 days, and last night in my budgeting course, my internet connection was a little unstable. And so sometimes when I turn off my camera, it'll add to the stability of my internet. So I'm going to just turn off my camera, and so you won't have to look at me during the entire class, but just hopefully we'll be able to stay online throughout the duration of the class tonight. If for some reason I do drop out, the way Zoom works, you probably experienced this before, but the way Zoom works is that if the host, being me, if I get disconnected, then the next person up in the class becomes the host to keep the session alive and active until I'm able to log back in. So if for any reason I disappear, just hang tight and I'll get logged back in as quickly as I can. Hopefully it won't be an issue as long as I'm not taking up too much bandwidth with my video. So, okay, turn my video off. We are recording like we do for each one of our sessions. And so again, it's completely up to you whether or not you want to use your camera. So we always want to protect your privacy rights. So welcome to week 3. Hybrid courses go by very quickly. And so believe it or not, we are almost to the halfway point of this course, which is unbelievable because it feels like we just started covering material. But what I have on the agenda for this evening is just wrap up a few notes from last time, and then to spend our time talking about accountability and ethics. And then if time permits, which I think it will, we can move into a discussion of the scope of the public sector and some differences between public and private sectors and public and private organizations. Thank you for your Beach Board essays looking at James Madison's Federalist number 10 and discussing factions and whether or not we are more factionalized today than we were back in Madison's times. I think all the essays were good. Everyone justified their position quite well. So I was very happy with that. I returned some feedback in the feedback box for everyone along with the grade. And I think for the most part, everyone got pretty close to, if not full credit for it. So I'm happy with your postings. And so for future Beach Board essays, just keep doing what you did for this past week. And I think you'll be very happy with your Beach Board essay grades. In terms of Federalist 10 and James Madison, as most people pointed out in their posts, Madison makes the argument that you can't really have a democracy without factions, that democracy is going to mean some natural conflict, that different groups will have different opinions and different perspectives, and invariably those groups will come into contact with each other. I think I shared with a few folks in my feedback, this is what we call the marketplace of ideas. And Theodore Lowy, I used to use his textbook when I taught American government, really talked a lot about this marketplace of ideas, whereas America is a marketplace where people can come with their ideas, they can exchange ideas, they can trade ideas, and it really is that type of a marketplace for the consumption of different types of ideas. Whenever you have an exchange of ideas, invariably you're going to end up having conflict, and that's what Madison was concerned about. How can we manage that conflict without getting rid of democracy or harming democracy? You don't want to, as they always say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't want to lose democracy, but you also want to have some type of a protection against some of the negative impacts of these factions. So I think everyone did a really nice job talking about that. I think that we sometimes, just kind of the general royal we as a society, we sometimes have this idealized vision of the late 1700s and the time of the framers as being this idyllic era where everybody got along and everyone was respectful of each other and you didn't have any negative advertising or negative politics. That's not the case. And John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, they were bitter rivals. They were battling out their rivalry with their own newspapers that they ran. Some of the attacks were very personal attacks, not just on the candidates, but personal attacks on the candidates' families as well. A lot of the attacks were not grounded in any fact, and it was, today you always hear the term fake news, but it really was kind of fake news in that there were a lot of lies and a lot of mistruths and half-truths that were going on back in the late 1700s. And so we've never really had that genteel political environment. So there were factions even back then. And those factions the Federalist and Anti-Federalist factions, as you know, probably end up hardening to create the antecedents for our current two-party system. We saw the Anti-Federalists become a party called the Jeffersonian Republicans, sometimes called the Democratic Republicans. Those Democratic Republicans then formed the basis for a more modern Democratic Party that really coalesced around Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 1830s. The Federalists kind of started dying out, and the remnants of the Federalists then kind of became that Whig Party. And the Whig Party then had a few years of dominance in the 1800s, and then they fell apart, and then the remnants of that then started this new political party called the Republican Party that then ran its first presidential candidate in 1856 and won the White House for the first time in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln. So those antecedents for our two-party system were all based on the factionalism that was going on in the late 1700s. I do think that today, most people make the argument that we're more factionalized today than perhaps we were back then. I think that there is a good justification for that argument. And I think we mentioned it briefly in this class before, but one of the primary reasons why we are so quote unquote factionalized today is because of the way in which we run our elections. And you're all familiar with the process of gerrymandering. And whenever we have political parties that gerrymander districts, that draw district boundaries either for the House of Representatives or at the state legislative level, they draw those boundaries in order to create what we call safe districts. So that Republicans will draw the boundaries to try and maximize the number of Republicans that will be serving in the House or in the state legislature. Democrats will do the same thing. It's not a one party or the other type of deal. Both parties engage in political gerrymandering. Whenever we have political gerrymandering, what happens is we try and create these safe districts whereby the incumbents can easily be reelected. So if a safe Republican district is going to be full of primarily Republicans, and they will then elect a Republican. And same type of thing over on the Democratic side of the aisle. Whenever they engage in political gerrymandering, there are a couple of strategies that we have seen parties use in gerrymandering. One strategy is what's called cracking, and the other strategy is called packing. In the cracking approach to political gerrymandering, what you will do is if, say, for instance, you are a Republican legislature, and your Republican majority wants to enhance its number of seats in the legislature. So it wants to draw as many districts that will produce Republican representatives. So in a cracking approach, if you had a large geographic area of Democrats, what you would do is you would crack that area up into multiple districts so that each one of those new districts will only have a sliver Democratic majority, and the rest of those districts will be a Republican majority. So you are cracking up that Democratic stronghold into multiple districts that, for your purposes, hopefully will all end up being Republican, because you're only including a small sliver of Democratic voters in each one of those new districts. The packing approach is just the opposite. If you have a stronghold Democratic area, you might make that area all one, or try to make it all one district, so that you're giving up that, yes, the Democrats are going to win this one district, but they'll be shut out of winning all the other districts by packing all the Democrats into just one district. And it's vice versa. So it goes for each party. Republicans do that to Democrats, Democrats try and do that to Republicans. When you have that type of political gerrymandering going on, you then create these safe districts. And so if it's a Republican safe district, the overwhelming majority of voters are Republican, and so there's very little chance that those voters are going to elect a Democrat. When you have those types of safe districts, the general election is no longer important to the incumbent. The incumbent, primary motivation of that incumbent is to try and get reelected. There's a very famous book in political science from several years ago by a person named David Mayhew, and I'll put this in our text chat. And David Mayhew wrote this book called Congress, the Electoral Connection. Just type that. Congress, the Electoral Connection. And in Mayhew's book, Mayhew makes the argument that the primary motivation of members of Congress is for reelection. In order to get reelected, members of Congress will engage in three activities. They engage in advertising. They have to get their name out there so that they can build name recognition and name recall. So with name recognition, someone can look at a list of names and they can say, yes, this person is my representative. This is a person who represents me in my congressional district. They recognize their elected official's name. Name recall is more powerful. In name recall, you would ask someone, who is your representative in the House of Representatives? And if you can name your representative, that person then has name recall, which is a very powerful tool for reelection. So they advertise, they get their name out there, all these wonderful things that they are doing. So you need to reelect them when they're up for reelection. One of the most famous political campaign commercials, and years ago, I used to work on campaigns and putting commercials together. But in this one, it was back before my time. So it was in the when Kennedy was running for president back in the election of 1960. And the commercial was a very simple commercial, but it's one of the most famous political commercials ever made. And it was a commercial where they're just in cartoonish type of fashion, there were just all these signs saying Kennedy. And over again, the song that played throughout the entire commercial was Kennedy, 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 over and over. That's all that was in the commercial, just the word Kennedy. That's because not a lot of people knew John F. Kennedy when he was running for president. He was a junior senator from the state of Massachusetts, but he wasn't all that well known. So they needed to get his name out there because he was running against an established politician in Richard Nixon, who had 8 years as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. People knew Richard Nixon. They didn't know this young upstart necessarily named John F. Kennedy. And so that's advertising, getting your name out there, getting your name recognized, and generating name recall. So they advertise. In addition to advertising, they also engage in processes such as position taking. And we see politicians do this all the time. They will take a very non-controversial position on a very high-profile issue. So, we always say in America, mom, apple pie, those are those types of all-American types of issues. Well, they'll come out very forcefully for those issues that people agree with. And they will take very high-profile, non-controversial positions in order to engage in a process known as minimaxing. They will minimize their risks and maximize their benefits by taking these high-profile, non-controversial positions. That helps them get reelected. And then third, and probably most importantly, they also engage in what's called credit claiming. So they will claim credit for projects, they'll claim credit for policies that are very popular. It's not unusual to see a bill introduced into either the House or the Senate with maybe one or two co-sponsors. But once that bill starts to pick up a lot of support and starts picking up steam, and it looks like that's a bill that's going to be, that will end up being approved, then everyone jumps on as a co-sponsor because they want to be able to claim credit for that very popular bill. So members engage in advertising, position taking, and credit claiming for the purpose of getting reelected because reelection is their primary motivation, according to David Mayhew. So since reelection is their primary motivation, they know if they're in a safe district that is controlled by voters from their political party, they know that they're going to win their general election. So if it's a Republican area, they know if they're a Republican, they're going to win the general election in November against a Democrat. There aren't enough Democrats who are in that jurisdiction in order to try and unseat you from office. So instead of worrying about the general election, you're more worried about the primary elections because you have to get through that Republican or Democratic primary. Once you get through that primary, you're a shoo-in in the general election in November. So that means you are going to have to really appeal to the ideological extremes in your parties because the people who tend to vote in primary elections tend to be the more active, the more ideologically left or right in whichever party we're talking about. Those are your party activists. So in order to appeal to those people in the primary election, you have to be more extreme in terms of your positions. So Republicans will go more extreme hard right. Democrats will go more extreme hard left. What that does is that makes it difficult for us to gain agreement. And that type of polarization, I think, is what's adding to and helping to fuel a lot of the factionalism that we currently see today in our society. So I think, political gerrymandering goes a long way. It's not the sole explanation, but goes a long way in terms of explaining why we see such differences in terms of factional approaches. And thank you, Ryan, for putting the link in there for the Kennedy advertisement. Advertisements used to be pretty simple back in the day, and they've become much more expensive and much better produced. It's really, if you're interested in political campaigns, it's a really interesting niche in the political science literature that looks at those campaign commercials and looks at them from 1960. Looks at the Daisy ad, which is a very famous ad that was run in the Johnson administration. Only ran one time. The Willie Horton ad, a very famous ad in the George H.W. Bush election. The tank ad, where Michael Dukakis decided it was a good idea to ride in a tank with a helmet that was about 3 times the size of his head. That was not a good political ad. And so lots of different ads have been run over the past several decades. And it's really fascinating to go back and look at those advertisements and kind of see their evolution over time. So thanks, Ryan, for putting that in there for everyone to take a look at. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons why we have this type of factionalism. And so I think everyone did a nice job talking about that factionalism and justifying their position as to why we have that factionalism today. Again, as Madison tells us, we can't throw away democracy just to get rid of factions. We have to control the effects of factions by balancing ambition against ambition, by balancing faction against faction. Another Federalist paper that we left off last week before we had a chance to talk about was Federalist paper number 39. And that's something I do want to talk about here before we get into a discussion of accountability and ethics, because I think it does a really nice job of kind of putting a bow on our entire discussion of the formation of the Constitution and the nature of the Constitution itself. Now, as you know, in the Federalist Papers, as we discussed last time, they're written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. John Jay gets his name attached to it, even though he only wrote a handful of Federalist Papers before he got sick. But the vast majority are written by Alexander Hamilton, I think it was over 50 by Alexander Hamilton, and another good chunk by James Madison. We know the purpose of the Federalist Papers, which try and convince the citizens of New York and the anti-Federalists to support this new Constitution. Because as we had talked about last week, in order to be ratified, the Constitution needed to have the ratification by 9 out of the 13 states. It got that ratification relatively quickly. The problem was it did not have New York, and that New York was not one of those 9 states. So the framers needed to reassure the citizens in New York that this new Constitution would not be too much of an expansion of a federal government. That it wouldn't create too strong of a national government. It wouldn't create this, what Thomas Hobbes called the Leviathan type of government. So that's why we got the 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and that's why we got these 85 Federalist Papers. So Madison, in Federalist Paper number 39, I think provides one of the most compelling arguments to convince the anti-Federalists to support the Constitution. And what Madison does in number 39 is he takes the Constitution and he dissects it, and he breaks it up into its component elements. He starts the paper by talking about Republican form of government and why it's important to ensure that Republican form of government. But I think probably the most important part of that Federalist paper is where he analyzes the Constitution to talk about whether it is a federal document or whether it is a national document. So for Madison in this discussion, a national document would be one where the power resides at the national level. And that would be one where the national government would have most of the power under the Constitution. That's what New Yorkers were afraid of. And so that's what he's arguing against. The other possibility is that the Constitution could be inherently federal in nature. And by federal, he was talking about states retaining power. And this is where it becomes a little odd that sometimes what we do is we take our modern language and we kind of overlay it on top of the framers' language and kind of substitute our interpretation of words for the way we think the framers interpret those words. And sometimes it's dangerous, and that's wrong. The framers, when they talked, and when Madison's talking about a federalist type of government, he's really talking about what we would talk about today as a confederation. So when he said a federation, today we would call that a confederation. So his federalism term was our confederalism term. So when he says a federal system of government, he means power retained by the states retain their own sovereignty. So his goal was to argue to the citizens of New York and the anti-federalists that most of this Constitution really kind of tilted toward a federalist as opposed to a nationalist approach, but there was a nice mixture of the two. So it's something they could get behind and something they could support. So he dissects the Constitution into its component elements. He said, well, let's start with how the Constitution was created and who created the Constitution, where the power comes from for the creation of the Constitution and this new union. Well, he points out, and rightly so, that people, the delegates, were there as representatives of their states. So the states sent delegations to the Constitutional Convention. So you got a very heavy state influence to begin with. To ratify this new Constitution, the new Constitution would have to be ratified by 9 out of 13 state legislatures. So 9 out of 13 states would ratify it. So essentially what he's arguing is the creation of this new Constitution is something done by the states. So therefore it's more of a federalist as opposed to a nationalist approach. Then he says, let's look at the all-important issue of power and how power is dealt with in the Constitution. So he says, let's start with the source of power. So where does power come from among these governmental organizations and institutions? Well, he says power is going to come primarily from Congress. And so you have a House of Representatives and you have a Senate. The House of Representatives is more national in nature than the Senate. House of Representatives, those members are elected for 2-year terms. Those members are directly elected by individual voters, by the people, making that more of a nationalist type of perspective. Then the US Senate, they serve longer terms, they serve 6-year terms, and they are not popularly elected. As you know from our discussion of the Constitution last week, they are selected by state legislatures. So he says it's a nice combination, that you've got kind of a national, plus you've got in the House, then you've got the federalist type of approach in the Senate. So you got a nice combination of the two. So let's look at the presidency and how the presidency works. Well, you've got this kind of unique system of the electoral college. And in that electoral college, you're going to have a large influence of state governments because of the election of electors. And the electors will select the president as opposed to being popular vote or popular sentiment. So again, you still got that federalism type of component. So he says in terms of the source of the power, it's split. It's part federalist, part nationalist. But if you really had to read between the lines, it kind of tends more over to the federalist side as opposed to the nationalist side. So don't be terribly concerned about it if you're concerned about its citizens of New York. It also says, we're used to these types of things. We're used to the types of terms that the president will serve because it's similar to what governors are serving in the individual states. Don't be afraid of this new Constitution. You're used to it because it's somewhat similar to your state constitutions that you are currently living under. Then he says, let's look at the use of power or the operation of power, how government is operated on a daily basis. Well, here he concedes a little bit and says, well, the actual operation of government will be done by individual administrators. Those individual administrators are not necessarily tethered to their states. So in terms of the operation of government, well, I'll admit it's going to be a little bit more national. So he kind of gives them that, says, yes, that will be a little bit more national. But in terms of the extent of power and where power extends to, well, again, it's going to be more federalist in nature, and that's going to be given to Congress, which has that federal component in the Senate. It also is going to be given to a president who is, again, elected through the Electoral College and that kind of federal component. So in that respect, it's a little bit more federal. So, well, let's look at how we changed the Constitution. Because when you look at the articles, one of the flaws was we had a difficult time changing the Constitution. So how do we change this new Constitution? Well, here, once again, it's primarily federal in that the states are going to ratify those constitutional amendments. And there's actually a provision in Article 5, as we discussed last week, whereby the states themselves can initiate a national constitutional convention, and then the ratification would be done at the state level. So again, very much of this federal type of component. So essentially what Madison argues in 39 is he very skillfully argues that it's really a combination of the both, a national approach as well as a federal approach, but we're really leaning more toward the federal side. So you anti-federalists, you do not have to fear this constitution. You do not have to fear this new national government, because it's really going to look a lot like what you're used to in your states, and it's really going to be a lot more federalist than it is nationalist in nature. But again, when you read Federalist 39, I think Madison makes a really good argument in Federalist 39, and kind of a social scientific argument, because he takes the document and deconstructs it into its component parts and then provides justifications for his positions. Despite it being a good analytical piece, we always have to remember the motivation behind it. And the motivation behind that piece was, again, to try and convince the citizens of New York to support this new constitution, because it's not a national type of constitution. There are a lot of those federalism components that will help protect the sovereignty and the rights of individual state governments. And obviously, taken together, the Federalist 39, along with the other Federalist papers, combined together with the inclusion of the Bill of Rights, got New Yorkers on board, and New Yorkers ratified the Constitution. The Constitution has been ratified by all 13 states. And as they say, the rest is history. But I think it's an important way, looking at Federalist 39, it's an important way to kind of wrap up our discussion of the Constitution by recognizing that the Constitution, yes, creates a national government, but it also very explicitly retains power for state governments. And this type of compromise between national power and state power is something that we have been dealing with over the past 200 plus years. And that relationship between national power and state power is a very dynamic one, as we talked about last week when we went through all the different eras of federalism. And it ebbs and flows. At certain points in time, we'll see more of a national orientation. Look at the New Deal programs of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the cooperative fiscal federalism era. That was really trending more toward national power. The Johnson administration, his creative federalism, trending more toward national power. Competitive federalism, a gradual increase in national power, but still a recognition of roles that are left for the state governments. And the national government and state governments start to contend over who does what in terms of policy. In the lead up to the Civil War, the representatives from southern states that ended up seceding from the Union, those representatives were very ardent supporters of states' rights and state sovereignty, very ardent supporters of a more federalism type of an approach to the Constitution and the nation. One of the most fiery orators, I guess you would say, for the South was John C. Calhoun. And he very strenuously in Congress would argue for state sovereignty. He was one who, unfortunately, was a big believer in slavery and made those beliefs very clear in his speeches in the U.S. Senate. So we've kind of got this compromise going on in our Constitution. I think Federalist 39 Madison really allows us to see all those compromises in one big nutshell, if you will, one microcosm of these types of compromises that we see between national and state government power. But regardless of whether we take a national or a federalist approach to understanding our Constitution, even Madison acknowledges that the operation of government is going to be something done by individuals, individual administrators. And that's true today. So one of the things we struggle with in public administration is, how do we hold people accountable, hold these administrators accountable to public will, while at the same time providing them with the space they need to be efficient and be effective in doing what they are doing on a daily basis. That brings us to the issue of ethics and accountability. Now, We are an MPA, we are a NASPA MPA program. And as a NASPA accredited program, NASPA allows MPA programs to deal with ethics in two ways. One, you can have a standalone required course in ethics, or a second way is to sprinkle ethics across your entire curriculum. As we said before, in our program, we chose the latter approach. So we sprinkle ethics across our entire curriculum. You get a heavy dose of it here in the 500 class, but you're also going to talk about ethics when you get to budgeting and HR and org theory and policy and research methods. So you're going to have those ethical components in all of your courses. But our purpose here tonight in this course is just kind of lay the groundwork for an understanding of the importance of accountability and ethics in the public sector. So to start off with this whole idea of accountability, what is accountability? Accountability is a relationship between people and things. It sounds very broad, and it is very broad. But for our purposes, in our context, it's a relationship between people, administrators, and the things that they are managing, resources. And it's how they manage those resources that we need to hold people accountable for how they are managing those resources. Because again, at the end of the day, those resources are publicly owned resources. Accountability is the foundation of bureaucracy because it allows policymakers to control the actions of administrators. The future week, you will read Woodrow Wilson, one of the most famous articles that really established the basis for public administration as a field of study. And it presents this politics administration dichotomy, saying that on one side, policies are made by elected officials, that's the political side. On the other side, the administrator side, those policies are then executed and carried out by public administrators. Now, as we'll see when we talk about the Wilson article, that line, the politics administration distinction, is not nearly as complete as Wilson would have led us to believe, that there's a lot of intermingling of politics and administration. But the idea is that policymakers pass these policies and administrators implement these policies. There needs to be some type of a thread that ties what elected officials do with what administrators do, so that elected officials can hold administrators accountable for implementing these policies in the way in which the elected officials intended. That's why we need accountability. That's why accountability is so central to the study of public administration. Accountability always has this very negative association, and people oftentimes shy away from holding others accountable, especially elected officials shy away from holding others accountable because they don't want to kind of bring any scandal upon themselves. They like to keep a distance. And so if they are truly holding administrators accountable, and there's a problem with the way in which those administrators are behaving, if the elected official knows about it, then the elected official is probably going to also be blamed for it, which will then hurt their reelection prospects. Again, it all goes back to David Mayhew and his theory of the election motivation, the reelection motivation of members of Congress. So there's a natural tendency for policymakers, for elected officials, to try and keep their distance from holding administrators accountable. And when they have this natural predilection to try and keep their distance from holding administrators accountable, then you really don't have that clear chain of command, that clear chain of accountability, whereby you can hold people accountable for their actions. So what we need to do with accountability is we need to try and strike a balance. I think the one thread that's going to connect this entire accountability and ethics discussion together tonight is this idea of a balance. In accountability, we need to balance our ability to control the actions of administrators with the ability to give them the flexibility they need in order to get their jobs done and to get their jobs done well. Sometimes if you micromanage and you'll have too much accountability, then these administrators won't be free to be able to be creative and to come up with innovative types of solutions. So accountability does have the potential to inhibit bold action on the part of administrators, and as we'll see again tonight, has the potential to make it more difficult for us to attract the best and the brightest into the public sector. If you're thinking about making a move from the private sector to the public sector, and you realize that once you become a member of the public sector, all of your emails are public communications. You're much more open to scrutiny and review of your actions in the public sector. You're held to a higher ethical standard. If those ethical standards appear too daunting, people are just going to stay in the private sector and they're going to avoid working in the public sector, and we could lose out on some very qualified and competent employees. So we know accountability is necessary, but there needs to be a balance. Too much accountability will inhibit the creativity and the boldness of our administrators. So over the years, the public administration literature has defined different approaches to accountability and how we can define and enforce accountability. The traditional approach is what's known as the legal boundaries approach, balancing individual freedom and governmental power. It goes back to this politics administration dichotomy of Woodrow Wilson. Policymakers, the elected officials on the political side make the policies, the administrators on the administration side execute and implement that policy. So it's the elected officials holding those public administrators accountable. So under the legal boundaries approach to accountability, if we have administrators who are playing politics, if we have administrators who are getting too involved in the policy world, in the political world, that's when we're going to have a problem. Because under this approach, administrators execute the law, elected officials pass those laws. And so they're kind of two different worlds. Well, we've already foreshadowed this by saying that that's not the way in which it works in the public sector. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Wilson article. And we'll get to the Wilson article next week. So a second approach to accountability is the political approach. The political approach says that the two sides, the politics side and the administrative side, are so inextricably linked, that they are so linked together, so enmeshed together, that you cannot have accountability. It's difficult for elected officials to hold administrators accountable because administrators are doing both administrative as well as political work, and their work bleeds over onto the political side. So it's kind of throwing your hands up in the air and saying, we really can't enforce accountability because they're going to be political. They're not just doing administrative types of work. I think the real answer to accountability is that third approach, the evolving policy problems approach. That after the New Deal, the legal boundaries and the political approach are no longer nearly as relevant as they used to be, because we no longer have a hierarchical chain of command or any singular set of professional norms that will guide the behavior of individual administrators. Rather, today, what we have is what I like to refer to much more of an it depends situation. You know, it depends is my favorite answer, and so what is my favorite question? Well, here's your it depends answer. It depends upon the individual situation in the organization. We recognize today that every agency, every public bureaucratic organization, every single one of those organizations will have their own unique culture. And so the culture of accountability in the Department of Homeland Security may look a lot different than the culture of accountability in the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Education. So in order to understand how we hold our administrators accountable, we need to understand the culture within those different organizations. So it's a much more organization by organization, culture by culture type of analysis than a one size fits all approach like the legal approach or the political approach. I think taking that it depends contingency based type of approach to studying accountability, I think is appropriate. I think it makes the most sense in our complex world of public administration, but unfortunately it also muddies the waters and it makes it more difficult for us to assign accountability and to measure accountability as well. But as we try and measure accountability, there are essentially three different elements of accountability that we try to assess. The first type of accountability is what we normally think of when we think of accountability in government, and that's fiscal accountability. Fiscal accountability, we are concerned with whether agency officials are spending money on the programs they are charged with managing and only on those programs. So we're essentially saying, how's the money being spent? Is the money being spent in the legally appropriated manner? If administrators are taking that money and they're spending it on something that's not appropriated for, something that's not authorized by Congress or a state legislature, then you have an ethical problem, then you have a problem with accountability. But this is the most common way in which we think of accountability from a fiscal type of perspective. Hold people fiscally accountable for how they are spending the public's money. But that's not the only approach to accountability. Then there's also process accountability. In process accountability, we are concerned about implementation, and we're concerned with how well agencies are performing their tasks, how well agencies are implementing these policies and these programs that they are charged with implementing. So we hold people accountable for their actions in terms of actually carrying out these laws and these policies and these programs. The third element of accountability is program accountability. This is where we really start looking at the goals and objectives of programs and policies. And we hold administrators and organizations accountable for how well they have achieved their goals and their objectives. So fiscal is how the money is spent. Process are the tasks that go into an everyday type of business of carrying out those policies and those programs. And then program accountability looks at, are we achieving the goals and objectives that we've established for ourselves with these policies and with these programs? So I think all three of those approaches to accountability are alive and well today. It's just we typically think about it in terms of money. When we think about holding people accountable, we think about holding them accountable for how they are spending precious taxpayer money, because it's a very, very limited resource, and you are entrusted as an administrator to spend that money in the way in which you are supposed to spend that money, and to spend it as efficiently and effectively as possible. So up to this point, I think we've established that accountability is difficult in the public sector. And it is inherently difficult to hold administrators accountable because oftentimes elected officials don't want any part of it. They don't want to hurt their reelection prospects by getting too close to accountability issues and too close to, we'll just say the word, scandals. So what's the solution to make us better able to enforce accountability and ethical principles? Again, the solution really hinges on this balance. We need to balance the external rules and regulations and the oversight from elected officials with internally to our agency, the internal forces, such as the ethical standards and the character and the training of our administrators. So in other words, to actually hold people accountable, we have to have both an external and an internal component. We need to have elected officials who are not afraid to hold administrators accountable. Well, on the internal side, we also need to have individuals and organizations who are committed to doing the public good and who are committed to spending public money in the right ways, to spend money in the legally appropriate ways, and to benefit the public as opposed to benefiting themselves. When we get to management of human resources in a couple of weeks, I will talk a lot about political machines, and I'll talk about this person named George Washington Plunkett. And George Washington Plunkett worked, George Washington Plunkett worked in a very famous political machine in New York City called Tammany Hall. And Plunkett, when he worked in Tammany Hall, really played very fast and loose with accountability and ethics. As you will see when I show you some of those excerpts from his book, he wrote some memoirs once he left Tammany Hall. And in his memoirs, he made argument for what he referred to as honest versus dishonest graft. And graft, we know, graft is corruption. So when you say graft, we mean corruption. So he's saying there's honest corruption and there's dishonest corruption. Now that sounds really weird for us in today's modern public administration. Corruption is corruption, and it's always bad. But for Plunkett, he said there's an honest version of corruption and there's a dishonest version of corruption. So if you just take money and you stuff it in your pocket at the end of the day, and you do that for 10 years, that's dishonest. You shouldn't do that. So that's dishonest corruption. But there's a category of corruption he called honest corruption. And he gives us an example. He says, say, for instance, I am working in City Hall. And as a public administrator in City Hall, within the scope of my duties, I find out that the city wants to buy up a bunch of land and make it into a park. So knowing that information, I go and I buy that land before the city gets to it. Then the city comes to me, has to buy my land from me. I make a pretty penny profit on it, and no one gets hurt. The city gets its land. I make money off of the deal. What's wrong with that? That's honest graft. That's honest corruption. Now, today we would say that's ridiculous. And I agree with John. It is a hilarious distinction from our perspective today. Because what Plunkett is explaining there is he's explaining a situation where he is using his public position for private gain. That information that he got that the city is going to buy up this land, that was inside information. That was information he only obtained as a result of being in City Hall in his position. And he then used that information to then benefit himself through his pocketbook by selling this land back to the city at a very high profit margin. You cannot use your public position for private gain. But just kind of give you an idea of some of the accountability and ethical issues we had with those political machines in the early part of the 1900s. They didn't make that distinction. For them, that was honest graft. That was honest corruption, and there's nothing wrong with doing it. Today, we know that's not something you should do. You cannot use your public position for private gain, which all boils down to the whole idea of operating in the public interest. And are you operating in the public interest? Can we hold administrators accountable to make sure they're operating in the public interest as opposed to their own personal private interest? But in order to do so, again, we're going to have a balance between our ability from the external perspective to hold administrators accountable, but also in the internal perspective to have administrators who know that distinction and to understand that they're there for the public good, not for their own private good and private welfare. We also have to protect people. So oftentimes when you do have corruption going on in an organization, the people who know that corruption is going on, those are the people who are actually working in that organization. Now, for accountability to work, we need to overcome some of the problems that are inherent in this theory known as the principal-agent relationship. I'll put that text chat. Oops. If I can type, there we go. The principal-agent relationship. The principal-agent relationship says that in any relationship, there is a principal and there is an agent. The agent is the party that is holding the principal is the person or the group that's holding the agent accountable for their actions. So obviously in this situation, it would be the principal would be the elected officials, the principal would be members of Congress, for example. The agent would then be members of federal agencies and departments. Congress, one of their main duties is oversight. So they oversee the actions of federal departments and federal agencies. Under the principal-agent relationship, you would think that in order to hold an agent accountable, the principal must have more information about what the agent is doing than the agent. The principal needs to have the information in order to hold that agent accountable. But what we know is the agent, this person, this relationship we're calling the agent, the administrator, is in the organization on a daily basis. They are seeing everything that's going on within that organization. Congress is not. Congress is far more external and remote. So Congress does not necessarily have the information it needs to properly oversee the actions of those agents within those federal agencies. So the problem with the principal-agent relationship is this problem of information asymmetry. So the agent has the information, the principal does not. So whenever the principal tries to hold the agent accountable, whenever Congress calls in agency heads to come and testify to do their oversight type of responsibility, Congress sometimes doesn't know the right questions to ask. And if Congress doesn't know the right questions to ask, Congress will not get the adequate information they need in order to hold these agencies and these agents accountable for their actions. So what we need to do is we need to try and resolve that information asymmetry. In resolving that information asymmetry, you would normally think, well, it would just be incumbent upon the agent to provide enough information to the principal to then be able to hold the agent accountable. But there is what we call a moral hazard within this principal-agent relationship. And the moral hazard is that the agent knows that they have the information. The agent knows that if they give the information to Congress, it will allow Congress to better do its job of enforcing accountability. But they also know by giving that information to Congress, Congress will have more scrutiny of the agent, and they'll probably make the agent's life a lot more difficult. And so there's this moral hazard about how much information the agent is willing and comfortable to give up to the principal to allow that principal to hold that agent accountable for their actions. But since the agent has the information, and since any ethical violations are going on within the organization, we need to have some system in place that will empower people within the agency to be able to, what we call, blow the whistle, to be able to report out some of these ethical violations so that Congress can find out about them and then hold those people accountable. So when you have people in the organization who see something going on that's unethical, they have a couple of choices. One choice for that person is to blow the whistle, to report that unethical behavior and really become the voice for accountability and ethics within the organization. They remain within the organization and they protest against these policies and actions and programs that are not in line with the public interest. So they give voice to some of this information that Congress needs to oversee the agency. The other option is these whistleblowers may leave the agency, and that's the exit option. That they decide, well, I'm going to leave because I disagree with what's going on here, and I can't deal with it anymore, so I'm just going to leave. We don't want them leaving because we want those people who are willing to blow the whistle, we want them to be in those agencies in the future so that they can point out these ethical problems within those agencies. So what we've needed to do over the years is protect these whistleblowers. And there's a very famous piece of legislation in 1990, the Whistleblowers Act. And the Whistleblowers Act, we put in place some prohibitions against the agency having retribution against whistleblowers, that they could not retaliate against whistleblowers. If you blow the whistle, you can't be demoted for blowing the whistle or getting any type of negative job action because you blew the whistle. You are protected under this Whistleblowers Act. And unless we can properly protect whistleblowers, there's no way for that information to get from the agency to the overseers in Congress in order to properly implement accountability and those ethical standards. So we work very hard to try and protect those whistleblowers. But as we said at the outset of this discussion, we want to hold administrators accountable for their actions, but we also want to be able to give them the freedom that they need in order to still be effective and efficient in their jobs. We need to attract the best and the brightest into the public sector. That is difficult, though, when we have this ethical standard upgrade. It's always called the shock of ethical upgrade that people experience when they go from the private sector to the public sector. And so what we need to do is develop an accountability system that will still incentivize people to come from the private to the public sector, yet still hold them accountable for their actions. And I think the challenge for us in attracting good applicants and high quality applicants is to, again, strike another balance, a balance between hiring the most skilled administrators and then still assuring that the public interest is being preserved. So we need to have an accountability system to hold people accountable while at the same time not handcuffing them, not making it more difficult for them to be creative and innovative in how they are doing their daily jobs. One way, and this is something that Charles Goodsell tells us, and again, it's a book from several years ago by Charles Goodsell, and it's referred to as, the title of it is The Case for the Bureaucracy. Case for the Bureaucracy by Charles Goodsell. Goodsell argues that what we need to do is we need to point out the importance of public service. And we need to point out that the public service is a high and noble calling. That, as Barack Obama used to say, that his goal was to make government service and public service cool again, so that people will want to come and work in the public service. And one way to get people to want to work in the public service is to demonstrate to them just how important public service is, to demonstrate to them just how much government touches their everyday lives. And once they recognize how much government touches their everyday lives, then they're usually more likely to respect and value the work of government officials and be more likely to want to become a government official and become a public administrator. Public administration is complicated. We have direct and indirect administration. Some programs are directly administered by public administrators, meaning that those public administrators interface directly with citizens and they deliver service directly to those citizens. Some other programs and policies are more indirect in their administration, in that government puts forth the money, but then the actual administration, the implementation, is done by a nonprofit organization or by the private sector. So we have really a patchwork of different approaches to serving the public in the public sector. But if we can show people that working in public administration, working in the public sector is a fulfilling vocation, then we can enhance our ability to attract the best and the brightest into the public service. And that's always our problem that we are struggling with, because we're asking people to come into a public service and typically get paid less than they would in a corollary position in the private sector, and to be subject to more scrutiny and more accountability and ethical standards than they would have been subjected to in a private organization. That's a very big lift. That's a heavy ask for individuals. And that's why sometimes it is difficult for us to go out there and recruit. And the stricter our accountability mechanisms are, sometimes the more difficult it even becomes to recruit quality employees in the future. But for our public administrators, we need to have ethical standards that we follow in the course of doing our daily jobs. And if you are maybe an engineer or a budget analyst, or you have another profession, your professional organization probably has its own code of conduct, its own code of ethics. And in order to be a member of that professional organization, you must abide by that code of conduct. As public administrators, we come from a variety of different backgrounds. We'd be engineers, we might be historians, we might be social workers, we might be psychologists, we might come from a military background. We come from all these different backgrounds. But the one thing that we do share is once we work in the public sector, we become public administrators. And the American Society for Public Administration, the #1 primary national organization for public administrators, has a code of conduct that it expects all public administrators to abide by. And you can see under this aspect code of ethics, which they revise every few years, but usually kind of looks the same from year to year. American Society for Public Administration advances the science, art, and practice of public administration. The society affirms the responsibility to develop the spirit of responsible professionalism within its membership and to increase awareness and commitment to ethical principles and standards among all those who work in public service in all sectors. To this end, we, the members of the society, commit ourselves to uphold the following principles. So here's the aspect code of ethics, the 8 principles that we normally expect public administrators to abide by. And it's important that we present that here in this class, because I don't know how many other opportunities in future classes you'll have to talk specifically about the aspect code of conduct. So I think with your first course in the program, it's important to kind of have that baseline understanding of the basic principles of being a public administrator. So principle #1 is to advance the public interest. Promote the interests of the public and put service to the public above service to oneself. This goes back to George Washington Plunkett in his honest graft. We know that's not honest. It's graft, it's corruption, it's not honest, because he was putting his own service to himself above service to the public. So we're always putting public service first. Second principle, to uphold the Constitution and the law. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. This is why last week we went through the Constitution. I had you read the Constitution. We went through all 7 articles and 27 amendments, because we are held accountable as administrators to upholding the Constitution and protecting individual constitutional rights. To protect someone's constitutional rights, you must first know what the constitutional rights are. That's why it's imperative for all public administrators to be aware of the Constitution. Third principle, to promote democratic participation. Inform the public and encourage active engagement in governance. Be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealings with public organizations. In a couple slides, we will talk about some of the specific devices, if you will, that we have here in the state of California to promote democratic participation and to promote openness and transparency and responsiveness on the part of our governmental organizations. Principle number 4, strengthen social equity. Treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. This inclusion of strengthening social equity tracks very well with the inclusion of social equity as one of the primary values of public administration. In public administration, there are several values that we try to emphasize. Obviously, effectiveness. We want to try and achieve our goals and objectives. Obviously, efficiency. We want to try and do more with less. We want to create more output with less resources. We also want to try and strengthen social equity. We want to make sure that people are being treated fairly and that we have justice and respect for all individual differences. We also want to be politically responsive, and that we want to be able to respond to elected officials with their requests for information to, again, try and get over some of those problems associated with the principal-agent relationship. We want to be a representative bureaucracy, in that we want our bureaucracy to represent the population that it is serving. So we've got a lot of different values that underpin public administration, and social equity is one of those very important values. Principle number 5, to fully inform and advise. Provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members and to staff members in your organization. We need to recognize that, again, we have the information oftentimes because we as administrators, we're the ones who are carrying out these programs on a daily basis. So we need to then provide the information necessary to decision makers so they have the information that they need in order to make their decisions. I served for 6 years as an elected member of a school board, and that board cannot do its work if not for the cabinet fully informing and advising the board on the operations of the district. And the board are 5 elected officials. They come to board meetings and they go to events and all those good things, but they're not in on the daily operations of that school district. It's the staff and the cabinet that are involved in those daily operations, so they need to fully inform and advise the board so that the board, the elected officials, the decision makers, can make the right decisions. 6, to demonstrate personal integrity, adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in the public service. The more scandals that are reported on by the media coming out of government organizations, the less trust there is in those government organizations. We are dealing right now with a situation in our country where there is very little trust among certain members of the public in several of our governmental institutions. That's a problem, because when people do not trust their governmental institutions, that bodes very poorly for the future of that government. So we need to demonstrate integrity in what we do so that the public can see that we're acting with integrity and build trust with us as administrators as well as with our organizations. Standard 7, to promote ethical organizations. Strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. We need to have ethical principles that we abide by within our organizations. And remember from that previous slide, the way in which accountability works today is every organization has its own standards and its own ethical principles and its own culture. And it's important that everyone within that organization have buy-in to that culture and those ethical principles, and then abide by those ethical principles. Then finally, principle number 8, advance professional excellence. Strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically and encourage the professional development of others. So we have a responsibility as public administrators to help the next generation of public administrators be effective and efficient. So to help the next generation of public administrators develop. This is why we have succession planning in our organizations. This is why we have mentorship programs within our organizations to try and advance principle number 8, advancing professional excellence. So those are the 8 primary ethical principles that public administrators need to abide by under the ASPA Code of Conduct. Now, again, if you belong to another professional organization like engineering or something else, you will have that profession's code of conduct as well. You'll then oftentimes have your own personal norms and your own personal expectations and ethical standards and morals. The problem we run into is when those sets of ethical standards come into conflict with each other. So when your organization's code of conduct comes into conflict with your own personal values, that in management and leadership means that it's probably going to have a demoralizing impact upon you as an employee, and it's going to lead to lower levels of engagement and lower levels of motivation. Same type of thing is when your organization's ethical principles come into conflict with your profession's ethical principles, or when the ASPA code of conduct comes into conflict with the code of conduct of a professional engineering organization. So there's that dilemma where codes of conduct can conflict with each other, and then administrators need to decide which code of conduct they are going to follow, and it becomes very difficult then for them to enforce accountability. But as I said, here in California, we do put a very strong emphasis on transparency, openness, and public participation. It's very much of what we call a sunshine approach, where you open up the doors and let the sun shine in. We know that our governing bodies have to abide by the Brown Act, whether you are a city council, whether you are a board of supervisors, whether you are a school board or a regional water district board, the Brown Act applies to you. And that means that your meetings must be conducted in public. They must be public meetings. You have to post your agenda at least 72 hours in advance. It's considered to be a public meeting if at least a majority of the board or the city council is in attendance. And so if you have at least a majority of your members in attendance, it's considered to be an official meeting, and that then needs to be open to the public. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't some things that can be done in executive or closed session. And if you work with the city council, I know a lot of people in our program work very closely with the city council in their respective cities. You'll know that oftentimes the board will have, the city council will have an executive or closed session and an open session. Here in California, to do it behind closed doors, number one, you cannot just start a meeting behind closed doors. Under the Brown Act, you have to start the meeting in open, in public, and then you have to recess into closed sessions. So closed sessions can only come out of an open session. But when you are in closed session, there's a limitation on the types of issues that you can discuss. And so, for instance, when I was on the board in our closed session, we could discuss potential or anticipated litigation against the district. And we can discuss that with our attorneys. Now, your attorney had to be present in the closed session for you to discuss those issues, because state law doesn't want members of the board sitting behind closed doors and making decisions out of the sight of public scrutiny. So you had to have your attorney in that closed session for that purpose. Personnel issues can oftentimes be handled in closed session for the privacy of those individuals. You don't want to go out in public session if you're reprimanding someone or firing someone. You don't want to go out in open session and talk about that person by name. So you do it in closed session, and then you report it out into open session. And you would say, something to the effect of, on a vote of, 5-0, the board approved the termination of employee number, and then give the employee number. So it's all done for the purposes of privacy. So there are some things that can be done in closed session, but it's a very limited list of things that can be done in closed session. And there are a lot of provisions in the Brown Act that we're not going to get into in this class, but there are a lot of different provisions that you have to abide by. I'm sorry, Elias, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we were just going to kind of get into, or maybe not get into some of the specifics on the Brown Act, but I just want to make a comment. I've sat on boards where, even email correspondence between, let's say, like 2 to 3 members of a board, that potentially constituted Brown Act. The Brown Act could have potentially applied there, and therefore the meetings would have to be made public. So it's a very nuanced, very specific law that many people that sit on boards often have to consult counsel on different things, even like on something as simple as texting between like 2 or 3 members of the board that could potentially make the Brown Act applicable. So it's very interesting law.
Yep, I agree. That's an outstanding point. You're right. It is. you have to be very careful, because those types of communications are then subject to the Brown Act. And so, if you have a text conversation with two other members of the board, that constitutes a meeting. And you can't do that, because it would have to be an open meeting, a meeting open to the public. It would have to be agendized in advance. So even with text, with emails, any type of electronic communication, that would be considered to be a meeting outside of the requirements of the Brown Act. And you're right, boards have to be very careful. They oftentimes will consult with their counsels to make sure that what they are doing is in accordance with the Brown Act. And we had a very important court case, the San Jose case, a few years ago, that also increased the scrutiny in terms of review of electronic communication. And so now, if you are using email or you're using text messaging to communicate with other members of your board or your council, those are all discoverable. And even if it's your personal cell phone and your personal cell account, but you're using it to conduct government business, that is then discoverable for a potential Brown Act violation. And so what I've seen is, I know some members of my board had two different phones. They had a personal cell phone, and then they had a cell phone that was only for school board business, because they knew that that would be then discoverable, because anything discussed within the jurisdiction of the board is then a discoverable type of communication. And where some boards, and you're exactly right, some boards run into problems is that they will get into what are called serial meetings. And so, say for instance, you have 5 members of city council, and you have, well, we'll say 5 members of the school board and a superintendent. And so the superintendent, contacts the president of the board and says, we really need to do something about this issue. So this is what I think we should do about the issue. And then the president then contacts another member of the board, and then that other member of the board then independently contacts another member of the board. You don't have 3 people talking at the same time. You don't have a majority of the board talking at the same time, but that's still a violation of the Brown Act. You can't have one member talk to another member, and that member then talks to another member. That's they call it a daisy chain type of violation. That would then make that a serial meeting. That would then be a violation of the Brown Act. And so I think boards have had a lot of work to do to try and come in compliance with the Brown Act. And if members of the public see something that's a Brown Act violation, they can report that. That can go to the Attorney General, and then the Attorney General's office can come back and investigate that situation to see whether or not a Brown Act violation actually did occur. The Brown Act also limits the types of information you can discuss in a meeting, that it must be agendized, it must be on the agenda. If it's something that does not appear on the agenda that was released to the public at least 72 hours in advance, then that's something that you cannot have you can't have a discussion and take action on it. Everything has to be on the agenda if you are going to act on those items. So again, you've got a lot of those types of limitations going on. I think we have a question in text chat. Let's see. Apply to universities as well. I work for university housing. I know our email text can be requested, but all of our meetings are not public. Does it apply more to Board of Trustees, school boards? There are 2 acts. There's a Brown Act and there's a Green Act. I know we like our colors in our acts, but the Brown Act applies primarily to elected bodies, so it will apply primarily to school boards. Other bodies, administrative bodies, are subject to the Green Act, and the Green Act has some of the similar types of provisions to the Brown Act. It's just not quite as stringent as the Brown Act. So let's see. John says there's another comment up here. Rebecca. Walking quorum. Yeah, quorum is, you have to have a majority in order to do business. And you have to, if you have a majority, it then becomes a meeting. If you have a quorum, it becomes a meeting, and then is then subject to the Brown Act. I know there's a little bit of controversy in my district when I was on the board, in that every year the board would go to the California School Boards Association conference in either San Francisco or San Diego. They kind of switched out every year. And there are some members of the board who were on the board when I joined who believe that if you were at a conference, the Brown Act did not apply, because what the Brown Act has is it has an exemption in it, so that if you are at a conference and you are presenting on a panel at a conference and you want to use information from your district as part of your presentation, you can have multiple members of your board on the dais as that panel. So you could have 3 members of your school board presenting at this conference as members of a panel. That is allowed, but that's the only exemption for a conference. So I had some members of my board who thought, well, since we're at a conference, after the meetings are over with at night, we can go to dinner and we can talk about board issues. No, you can't. That's a violation of the Brown Act. You have to actually be on that panel in order to qualify for that exemption. And I can provide for you, I've got the little primer on the Brown Act. I can put it up in our website if you're interested, and you can go through and see all the different provisions in that Brown Act. But also closely related to the Brown Act are public records requests. And here in California, we have an act that allows the members of the public to request public records. And then government organizations need to respond to those public record requests. They usually have 10 days to respond. There is an exemption there if for some reason you can prove that obtaining the information is going to take longer than 10 days. You can get an extension on that. But we have 10 days that you have to respond and provide those documents and provide that information to members of the public. It's obviously a good provision for transparency and openness. Sometimes public records requests get abused. And so sometimes members of the public want to slow down the operations of an organization. So what they will do is they will inundate that organization with public records requests. And so staff members spend all their time scrambling around trying to get all this documentation prepared, and they don't have time to then do the business of the city or do the business of the district. And so sometimes they've been used by members of the public to really slow down the work of government. But they were there, again, to allow people to see the documents that are being produced and discussed by that governing board or by that city council. Some folks may be in a conflict of interest position, a reportable position, which means you have to fill out Form 700, your conflict of interest form, where you have to disclose any potential conflicts of interest that could conflict with your official duties. So, when I was on the board, I filled out my Form 700, and I had to report if I owned any property within the jurisdiction that was not considered my primary residence, if I had any other income coming in from sources within my jurisdiction. I had to report that income and those sources. Because again, we want to make sure that if you're participating on a board, you don't have a conflict of interest where giving a contract to a contractor would benefit you on an individual basis. And so, they're there to try and protect against what George Washington Plunkett did with his, what he called honest graft and honest corruption. So to kind of wrap up the discussion, in order to have proper accountability in the public sector, as we've said over and over again tonight, we need to strike that balance. We need to strike a balance between holding administrators accountable for how they are spending public money and implementing public programs and policies, but we also need to free them up so that they can have the flexibility they need to be as efficient and effective as they can possibly be. And we also need to still be able to attract the best and the brightest into the public sector. So again, the real balance we're looking at here with accountability is balancing ethical adherence with effectiveness. Because unless you can balance ethical adherence with effectiveness, you won't be able to meet the public demands that you are expected to meet and operate in the public interest as you're expected to do as public administrators. So again, this has just kind of been prepared for you as kind of an introduction to accountability and ethics in the public sector. This is just kind of creating that foundational level on ethics and accountability that will help you as we move on into your future core courses. You're going to return to discussions of ethics, but you'll return to those within the context of the classes themselves. And so in budgeting, you'll talk about the ethics of spending public money and public versus private versus toll versus common pool goods. In HR, you'll talk about the ethical dimensions of managing human resources. In organization theory, you'll talk about codes of conduct developed within the culture of that organization. Policy, we'll talk about the ethics of the policies that we are providing and the fairness and equity in the policy outcomes for the policies that we are implementing. Obviously, in research methods, you'll talk a lot about ethics, and you'll talk about ethical principles like autonomy and beneficence and justice that you have to adhere to whenever you're doing research or when you're doing program evaluations, you have to protect those three main ethical principles when you are in contact with any subjects in your research. So ethics does not end here. The coverage of ethics will go throughout the entire curriculum, but hopefully this discussion is kind of giving you that framework and that foundation to then move forward into those core courses with a more specific discussion of ethics for each of those core content areas. So any questions or observations about any of this material on accountability and ethics? Again, I'll put my Brown Act primer up into our Beach Board site if it's not there already, so you can kind of take a look at it and familiarize yourself with at least some of the highlights of the Brown Act. But any basic questions at this point in time? Okay, if not, then I think I'm ready for a break. Hopefully you're ready for a break as well. So
Professor.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, this is just more for the assignment. It says, to discuss three of the principles in the ASBA, and then it says for our organization. Does that mean our job?
Yes, for you and your job and your organization, which three of those you think would be most challenging? So yes, for you in your job.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that. That's your next Beach Board essay assignment. Looking at those 8 principles that we talked about tonight, selecting 3 of those principles, and talk about which of those 3 you think may be most difficult for you to do in your job in your organization. Good question. Thank you for asking that. Okay, let's go ahead and take about a 15-minute break. We'll round it to about 15 minutes. Let's come back at 5:35. And we come back at 5:35. I want to work ahead a little bit for some information from next week because, as I told you, we have Kelly Janicek, who is our disciplinary librarian, who will be running the first half of our session next week, the first 90 minutes of the session, giving you a primer in terms of all the different databases that you can use to do public administration research. She does an excellent job. It's one of the most useful sessions you're going to have that will help you throughout your entire time in the program. So we're going to give her the first 90 minutes next week. So I thought what we could do this week is work a little bit ahead so we don't fall behind and talk a little about public bureaucracies, public organizations, the scope of public organizations, and then a bit about the differences between public and private sectors. So we'll do that after the break. Come back at 5:35, and that's the information we'll cover then. Okay? Talk to you in a few minutes. Okay, well, welcome back. Hope you had a good, although very brief break. Again, just to circle back to the Beach Board assignment, Beach Board essay number 2 that is due next week. If you have any concerns about including the name of your organization, then you don't need to. So you can always keep it very anonymous with your organization. You can just say, this may be this principle could be difficult for my organization, and this is why. And so I leave it completely up to you whether or not you want to identify your organization, but certainly don't feel like you have to. And you can keep it anonymous from an organizational perspective. So you don't have to worry about that whatsoever. Okay, but what I thought we'd do in a few minutes tonight is, I'm not going to do this entire topic tonight, but because we have Kelly coming in next week, I just want to make sure we could kind of stay on schedule with where we need to be since we have such limited time here together. So I thought we would get started on some of next week's information and specifically talk about the idea of public administration and talk about public administration, kind of what the study of public administration really entails, and then talk about some of the differences between how we study public versus private administration. So we know, as we've said many times already in this class, that public administration has an immense size and immense scope. That government bureaucracies are encountered everywhere. And on a daily basis, we encounter either public organizations or things that public organizations have done. So as we had said before, the food you eat in the morning for breakfast will be regulated in terms of safety and food quality. The car you drive will have safety regulations and EPA regulations in terms of fuel economy. driving on roads that are paid for with public taxpayer dollar, and so on and so on. So we know that we touch government in just about every single aspect of our life. And our goal in public administration is to achieve administrative responsibility, whereby we can implement programs in an efficient and effective manner while still being held accountable to policymakers and to the public. And so our goal, again, is for efficient and effective program implementation with accountability to elected officials and to the public. So the study of public administration really is very much the study of public bureaucracies. And whenever we say the word bureaucracy, I know there are always some negative associations with the word bureaucracy. We think about bureaucracy and we think about something that's very big, something very impersonal, something that probably is not all that efficient, something that is not terribly effective at achieving its goals. It usually has those negative types of connotations. Public bureaucracy, however, as a definition, refers to public organizations, these formal, rational systems of relationships among people vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. So a basic definition of public bureaucracy is that the formal, rational system of relationships among persons vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. So let's kind of deconstruct that definition a little bit into its component elements. So obviously we're talking about public organizations. We're talking about organizations as being formal and rational systems of relationships. Now that rational term is something that we're going to pick up on when we talk about the theoretical approaches to the study of public administration in a future class. And we'll talk about people like Max Weber, one of the first organization theorists that you'll cover in your organization theory class. And we'll talk about his belief in rationality and how he believed that a bureaucracy was the ultimate level of rationality, whereby we make our decisions based upon information. We don't make decisions based upon what we feel or what we think. We make those decisions based upon information that we have acquired, information we have critically analyzed, and we're going to use that information to then make our decisions. So these public organizations, these bureaucratic organizations, are rational. They're formal, meaning that you have an organizational chart, you have preordained positions within the organization, you have people working within position classifications with position and job descriptions. It's a very formal, rational type of system of relationships among persons, and that's the next important part of the definition. So when we're looking at bureaucracies, we're trying to understand the relationship between those administrators, between those bureaucrats in that organization, as well as how those persons, those bureaucrats in organizations relate to their larger external environments. So it's all about these relationships. Inherently, what that means is when we study public administration, we study these bureaucratic organizations, we are studying human beings. We are studying human subjects. When we're studying human beings, we know that human beings can have a tendency to be irrational. They don't always make rational decisions that are meant to enhance their survival. So we know they can be irrational. We know that there's some subjectivity when we are studying individual human beings. That's what makes public administration very much of a social science. The next part of that definition is also really important, that we're looking at relationships among people who are vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. That word authority is what really jumps out at you from that definition. And that's one of the ways in which we are going to distinguish between private organizations and public organizations. And that public organizations have this inherent legal authority that private organizations oftentimes lack. There is a legal basis and a legal authority for the mere creation and presence of that public bureaucratic organization. Bureaucratic organizations in the public sector are created out of enabling legislation. So they are created by governmental entities like Congress or like a state legislature, which then gives them that type of formal authority. And authority is then used by public organizations to then coerce individuals to take certain types of actions they may otherwise not take. In other words, based upon that definition we had last time about power, to exert power over citizens to get them to take certain types of actions. One of the basic characteristics of a government is the power of coercion. And that's what public organizations have that sometimes private organizations lack, at least from a legal or constitutional basis. So we're studying public bureaucracies within our study of public administration, which means inherently we're studying organizations, public organizations. The contention about bureaucracies and bureaucratic organizations, especially in the public sector, is that they are too inefficient to accomplish much of anything, but at the same time, they're made up of all too efficient users and abusers of power. So among the public, the basic belief oftentimes is that government is inefficient. Government's unable to do what it's supposed to do, but they're not at the same time having a very dim view of bureaucrats, that bureaucrats, even though they're in inefficient organizations, they are efficient abusers of power. So it goes back to Charles Goodell and the argument he made that the bureaucracy really has an uphill battle to fight in terms of public perception, that it always tends to have this very negative association when you use the word bureaucracy. And that's something that we as administrators need to try and battle against in order to, again, demonstrate ethical adherence within our positions and demonstrate why what we are doing is integral to the everyday lives of the people we are serving. Public administration for years has really suffered from a crisis of identity in that it frequently tries to separate itself from private administration. And I know for how many of you, whenever you told people you were applying to an MPA program, you said MPA, but they may have heard MBA. And I know, when people ask me what kind of program you teach, I say it's an MPA program. They say, oh, business. No, it's not business. It's Masters of Public Administration. And then people always ask, well, what's public administration? Or what's the difference between public administration and an MBA, a Master's in Business Administration? And we struggle with that type of crisis of identity all the time. I think one good way to address those types of questions and the differences between public administration and business administration is to look at the role of political or public authority for public administration. Public organizations have that type of public authority, whereas private organizations oftentimes lack that type of legal public authority. There are also some characteristic organizational processes that are different in the public sector than they are in the private sector. And we'll go through some of those in a couple of minutes, but things such as how we hire employees, how we evaluate employees, where our funding comes from, how we manage our budgets. Those characteristic organizational processes are done somewhat differently in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Another big difference that can help us deal with this crisis of identity and kind of separate us from private administration is this idea of policy formulation versus policy execution. So policy formation or policy formulation, I use those terms interchangeably, but policy formulation is the actual creation of the policy. Policy execution is carrying out that policy once it is created. In the public sector, we engage in both policy formation as well as policy execution. We advise elected officials in the formation process for those policies. We engage in administrative rule making, where we will write the rules to implement those very vague and ambiguous policies that are passed by elected officials. That's all the formulation process. Execution is the implementation, and obviously in the classic definition of public administration, that's our primary job, is to implement and execute those policies. So we're involved in both policy formulation as well as execution. Typically, a private sector organization is going to be involved in policy execution, but will be much less involved in policy formation or formulation. So that's another way to kind of distinguish between the two sectors. We do both. In the private sector, they're primarily execution as opposed to formulation. Here's another way to look at some of the differences between public and private sector organizations, and that's the rule of law. Take, for instance, this piece of legislation known as the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act forbids government officials from spending on anything that is not explicitly authorized by law. So if a government organization wants to spend public taxpayer money, it can only spend public taxpayer money on expenditures, on objects of expenditure that are explicitly authorized by law. That money must first be appropriated for those purposes. So as a public organization under the Anti-Deficiency Act, we are very much limited in how we can spend our money. By contrast, private organizations can spend their money on anything as long as that is not forbidden by the law. So for us in the public sector to spend our money, it must be authorized by law. For the private sector, they can spend on anything they want as long as it's not forbidden by the law. And that's a big difference between what we can do in the public sector versus what our counterparts in the private sector can do. This Anti-Deficiency Act became very important a couple of years ago when we had the government shutdown. And so a couple of years ago, in the Trump administration, we had a government shutdown. And what happened is we were unable to come to agreement on all 12 appropriation bills. And so for those appropriation bills we had not yet come to an agreement on, we passed what are called continuing resolutions. So we just stopgap measures to keep funding those agencies in the new fiscal year. Eventually, the political appetite wore out for these continuing resolutions. So what we ended up doing is we ended up getting a government shutdown. So those agencies and those departments that had not yet had their appropriation bills passed, they did not have the legal authority to spend money. Since they didn't have the legal authority to spend money, they couldn't spend money. And so we had to have a government shutdown for those agencies and those departments. The Trump administration had some tax cuts, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed. And those tax cuts were coming in the form of payments that were coming out of the IRS. And the IRS had these refunds that were coming as a result of these tax credits, and they were sending out to citizens. Well, the problem was that the Department of Treasury was one of those appropriation bills that had not yet been approved, so the IRS did not have the legal authority to continue processing those tax credits and those refunds. So what the Trump administration wanted to do is it wanted to take money that was appropriated for something else and put that money to the IRS so that those employees can come into work and the IRS can function and get those tax refunds out. There's pushback against that because that was a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Since there was no appropriation bill for the Department of Treasury, that meant that the IRS had no legal authority to spend money. And so therefore, it wasn't allowed to spend the money. And so we really had this question about, was that a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act to take money from another area and give it to the IRS? What ended up happening is we resolved the government shutdown, we resolved the impasse, government shutdown ended, and that question then became a very moot question. But I think it's another good way of showing differences between public and private organizations. We can only do what we're authorized to do. Private organizations can do what they want as long as it's not forbidden by the law. Now, you have an article that's assigned. I know it's assigned for next week, so you probably haven't read it yet, but you will be reading it, by Graham Allison, that asks the important question of how similar and how different public and private sectors are. And it asks the question, are public and private organizations fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? Meaning that, are the similarities between public and private sector organizations, are they unimportant? Yes, they're similar in some aspects, but are those similarities unimportant for our consideration of the differences between the two sectors? What Allison argues in his article, and again, you'll be reading this next week, which is a foreshadow a little bit, is Allison makes the argument that there are some common management functions that are done by managers in both the public as well as the private sector. So as public and private managers, we all have to engage in staffing. We all have to hire employees. We have to train those employees. We have to allocate positions in our organization among those employees, essentially assign duties, right there, position descriptions. We have to pay employees. We have to evaluate their performance. We have to decide when we need to train those employees, what type of development they may need. We decide when those employees need to be disciplined, sanctioned, or eventually terminated. Those HR types of functions are done both in public as well as private organizations. So that's a similarity. Both public and private managers also must budget. So your organization's not going to be around for long if you don't have the money to support that organization. So we all develop budgets. We all manage those budgets. We all analyze those budgets. We all decide how to get more with less out of those budgets. So we all do budgeting. We all plan. Public and private sector managers both plan. They plan the strategies of their organization. They plan their organization's operations. We do all that strategic planning in both the public as well as the private sector. We interface with our environment in that we interface with the media, we interface with interest groups, we interface with other organizations. We have to have good supportive working relationships with our external environment, both in the private as well as the public sector. So the basic thrust of the argument is that there are some core management functions that are similar between public and private sector organizations. However, the difference is in how those functions are done and how those processes are carried out. So for instance, let's look at management of human resources. In private organizations, employees are what we call at-will employees. They are hired at will by the organization. The organization can terminate those employees whenever the organization sees fit. They serve at the will of the organization. So they're at-will employees. In the public sector, we have civil servants. So our employees in the public sector, typically in our organizations, belong to a career civil service, which means they are hired based upon their knowledge, skills, and their abilities, their merit, and they retain their jobs based upon the performance of their tasks and how well they're doing their jobs. But it's much more difficult for us to sanction and terminate a career civil service employee than it is an at-will employee in the private sector. So you can think of all the differences between an at-will employee and a career civil service employee. Now start with the hiring process. When you're hiring an at-will employee in the private sector, you can hire that person very, very quickly. You can bring that person in for an interview. You can interview whomever you like, and you like this person, you like the way they conduct themselves in the interview, and you say, you got the job. Go down to HR, get on payroll. We'll see you here tomorrow morning. That's how you can hire an at-will employee in a private corporation. In a public organization, obviously you can't do that because we have a career civil service system. So what you have to do is you have to go through a very protracted and very regimented hiring system, because we want to make sure that we are hiring people based upon their merit, their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we are not hiring people based upon preferential treatment or discrimination or anything else. So when we hire people in the public sector, it takes a very long time. I don't know how long, for those of you who work in the public sector, it took you to actually get hired into your position, but it's not unusual to take 3 to 6 months before we can hire people into their positions. Again, we also then have to have a very regimented hiring process where, the way in which it works here at Cal State Long Beach, I'll tell you, is when we're going to hire someone, a faculty member, we have to advertise that position, and we have to advertise that position in a multitude of different sources. Those different avenues we're using to advertise the position have to have contact with multiple different groups within our population. So we have to show that our advertising is done in a diverse way in order to maximize the diversity of the pool of applicants that we get. That advertising plan has to be approved not only by the dean's office, it also has to be approved by the Office of Equity and Inclusion, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So the Office of Equity has to approve that recruitment plan. The position announcement has to also then be approved by the dean's office as well as the Office of Equity. Then once we put out that call for applications, then once the applications come in, we put together a pool of applicants. That pool of applicants that we get must again be approved by the dean's office as well as the Office of Equity. Once we decide on a short list of candidates, maybe 10 to 12 candidates to do Zoom interviews with, that pool of candidates again must be approved by the Office of Equity. If that pool of candidates does not represent the diversity necessary, then the Office of Equity will come back and say, here are additional candidates that you can select from to add to your list of your short list of candidates. When we then select 3 people to bring to campus for on-campus interviews, as you guessed, also has to be approved by the dean's office and the Office of Equity. So it's a very long process. We'll start, if we're going to hire a faculty member, we will start in June with advertising the position. And typically an offer probably will go out sometime in February or March to then begin the next fall semester. So we need to do that again to protect social equity, to make sure that we are protecting individual rights, and make sure we're getting a representative bureaucracy. So just the hiring process itself is certainly much different. The process in terms of how we manage those employees will be much different as well. At-will employees can be fired for non-performance very quickly. A private corporation can say, you're not doing your job well, so here's your severance check, we're firing you. Can't do that in a public organization. If you monitor the work of somebody in a public organization, you have to document multiple instances of subpar performance and then offer opportunities for training and development to try and mitigate that poor performance. You need to provide them with the skills necessary to improve their performance. You can discipline, sanction, and eventually terminate public employees, but you have to have a very long trail of documentation of subpar performance, training intervention, subpar performance, training intervention on multiple occasions before you'll be able to dismiss that career civil servant. So it's a big difference in how you hire and manage career civil servants as compared to how you hire and manage at-will employees. How we measure performance in public organizations is different than in private organizations. We know that we do performance measurement in both sectors. But in the private sector, oftentimes performance measurement standards are much more objective and they're much more quantitative than they are in the public sector. In the public sector, we can have some more subjective, qualitative measures of performance, such as, did this program enhance the quality of life of recipients? Well, for quality of life, that's going to be an index variable. We're going to have some subjective measures to measure quality of life. In the private sector, if you want to measure your performance selling widgets, that's pretty easy to do. You look at how many widgets you sold and what type of a profit that you made in selling those widgets. So it's more difficult and more subjective and qualitative to measure performance in the public sector. We do performance measurement in both sectors. It's just different in how we do it in the public sector. There are competing standards. In the public sector, we always talk about serving many masters. And that's how we wrapped up that lecture last time was, the so what? Well, so we have separation of powers, so we have federalism. What does it mean? It means we serve many masters, which means that there are competing standards that we are held to in the public sector more so than competing standards in the private sector. Public scrutiny. Obviously, since we are spending public taxpayer money, we are in public positions, we are subject to a lot more public scrutiny than a private sector corporation would be. Our school board or city council must abide by the Brown Act. They must have public meetings and agendize at least 72 hours in advance. Most corporate boards don't have to do that, and they can have their corporate board meetings behind closed doors. The media are usually much more interested in scandal stories coming out of the public sector as compared to the private sector, because again of the public money that we are spending. The ability to persuade is also different between public and private organizations. Public managers, because of these many masters, because of these competing standards and oversight, sometimes don't have as much power and authority over their employees as their private sector management counterparts. So when you don't have that formal authority over people who are working for you, you need to rely much more on the power of persuasion. So there's much more persuasion that goes on in public organizations as compared to private organizations. And as we had said before, there's a lot more oversight in the public sector. We have oversight from elected bodies, we have oversight from regulatory bodies, from elected officials, much more oversight in the public sector than what we see over in our private sector counterparts. And again, that's just kind of a taste of some of the differences of how the functions that go on in the public sector differ from how those functions are done over in the private sector. Now, the basic way we oftentimes distinguish between public and private organizations is by profit. And we oftentimes say, well, the big difference is that private activities, private organizations operate to generate a profit. Public organizations do not operate to generate a profit. That is true. There's no getting around the fact that that's a true distinction. But that distinction alone is not good enough to distinguish public and private organizations. So consider, if you will, private non-governmental organizations. There are private non-governmental organizations such as nonprofits that do not operate to run a profit. They operate to advance the social agenda. They're not government organizations, they are private organizations, but they're private organizations that do not run a profit. Likewise, there are some government organizations that do run a profit, things like the government corporations. So the U.S. Postal Service is considered to be a government corporation. As a government corporation, the U.S. Postal Service is, at least in theory, allowed to operate at a profit and to generate a profit. It's a public organization, but it's allowed to operate at a profit. So profit motive alone is not good enough for distinguishing public and private organizations. I think we really have to get into the specific functions and how the functions are done in the public sector versus how the functions are done in the private sector. And I do think a good way to distinguish between the two sectors is on this idea of policy formation versus policy execution. As we said, both public and private organizations share the same or share basic features of policy execution. They are involved in implementing laws, both government organizations as well as private corporations. However, public organizations are almost uniquely involved in policy formation. Now, private organizations can certainly lobby in the process. They can create lobbying organizations that can then lobby for that industry's behest in the policymaking process, but they're not nearly as directly involved in policymaking as public organizations. Elected officials are going to rely upon the information and the expertise that they can get from public organizations and public administrators to help them formulate their policies. So I think that's another good way to kind of distinguish between public and private sectors. And again, this just repeats the same thing, that public organizations are involved in both policy formation as well as policy execution. Execution's carrying out the policy. Policy formation is before the policy is made, advising elected officials on the content of that policy. And then even after policy is passed, doing the rulemaking implementation type of work to make sense of how this policy actually should be implemented on a daily basis. The implication of having public administrators and public organizations inherently involved in the policy formation process means that public policy has now become increasingly technical. There's an increased technicality of public policy because of the participation of the experts in the public sector and public organizations. And so you have more technical policies because of public administration and public administrators' role in formulating those policies. We've also seen, because we have more public agencies involved in policy formulation, we have seen an expansion of the chief executive's role as a major agenda setter in policy making, because the head of these agencies and departments at the federal level will be the president. The head of state agencies and departments will be the governor. So we've seen a pronounced increase in the role of the chief executive in the creation of policy. So it's no longer policy is done by a legislative body. Oftentimes, chief executives, through executive actions, are making policies independently, and they're making those policies independently, oftentimes on the advice of those agencies and departments in the executive branch. So this is your so what question. So government agencies are very involved in policy formation. Well, so what's that resulted in? It's resulted in a stronger role for the chief executive in policymaking. And it's also resulted in more technical policies because of the participation of expert public administrators. So we've got these differences between public and private organizations, but I think the major takeaway, at least at this point in time from this discussion, is that there are core generic management functions that are done by both sectors. Hiring, managing budgets, planning, that's done by both sectors. The difference is in how it is done in the public sector versus how it is done in the private sector. And I want to give you a chance to read the Graham Allison article for next week, and then we can pick up here and talk about Graham Allison and some of the specifics of Allison's argument and really flesh out some of those specific differences with how generic management theory is applied in the public sector versus how it's applied in the private sector, again, for the purpose of distinguishing public from private organizations. Then I'd also ask you, there is an article by Woodrow Wilson. If you go ahead and read that article as well for next week, because we're going to work ahead a little bit next week. Read the Woodrow Wilson article, The Study of Administration, and then we'll get into a discussion of the field of public administration. And we'll have our discussion about, is public administration just a field of study, or is public administration an academic discipline? And we'll talk about this politics administration dichotomy that Wilson gives us and the impact of that politics administration dichotomy for how we as students of public administration study the field of public administration. So just to recap for next week, read the Graham Allison article. We'll pick up there and talk about more of these differences and how these functions are done between the sectors. Read the Woodrow Wilson article, and we'll get into the foundational aspects of public administration as an academic discipline and move on from there. From that point, the next place we'll move will be some of the theories in that academic discipline of public administration, and I'll introduce you to the evolution of those academic theories within the field of public administration. So I think we probably will call it a night at this point, just because I want you to read the Graham Allison article and the Woodrow Wilson article before we discuss them next week. So we'll call a night here. Remember, when we come back next Wednesday, we'll start with Kelly Janicek. She'll do the whole first half of the class. We'll take a break. Then we'll talk Graham Allison, Woodrow Wilson, and the field versus discipline of public administration. And that's what we'll have on the agenda then for next Wednesday. Please do remember to complete your second Beach Board essay and submit that by next week. Again, if you don't want to use the name of your organization, that's absolutely fine. You can keep it as generic and anonymous as you would like, but you'll select 3 of those principles from the ASPA Code of Ethics and discuss why they may be difficult for you in your job in your given organization. If you're not currently working in an organization, then you can think about it from a more theoretical perspective of a position you would like in the organization you would like to work for. Okay, any questions about any of this material that we have covered tonight? Okay, and my internet held out, so that's always a very good sign. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your week. I look forward to reading Beach Board essay number 2. As always, if you have any questions at all about any of this information, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, we'll be back at it again next Wednesday at 4 o'clock, and we'll start off with Kelly Janicek and the library introduction. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good night and have a good weekend.